Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm VP of Product Engineering for Grainger. Do you guys know what Grainger is or who Grainger is? Yes? But let's actually see a commercial, kind of reinforce that point.
For the line crew and the go-getters. For shoulders to lean on and backs that don't break. For everyday heroes keeping doors open, lights on, and gears turning, there's Grainger. Supplies and solutions for every industry, plus 24/7 support and over 250 local branches. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Ooh, yeah, the ones who get it done. You know, as mentioned in some of the themes that came out of that commercial, right? It's the people that you see in the commercial are the ones who actually run the country, right? They do what they do because they're essential. We do what we do by understanding what enables our customers to be successful, right? That's why we keep the world working in that way, but at the same time, that's the reason why we are the ones who get it done, right? So this commercial took me back to a time during the pandemic. And so the conversation of this talk is really, or the scope of the talk is really during the pandemic till now. So the commercial was released early last year, or early part of the pandemic, where you think about a time where we didn't know much about COVID. We didn't know about this disease to the extent where we were asked to be isolated. And those experiences that we felt being isolated were, varying degrees of emotion, anger, depression. There's a ton of emotions out there. At the same time, we saw people getting sick. We saw people passing away, unfortunately. And so it was very stressful, at the end of the day. And then this term called essential workers started to become a norm, where the government started asking the essential workers to go back to their manufacturing plants, to their chemical factories, to hospitals, and in some cases, trying to figure out creative ways to drive education, right? So there was different things that were happening where it was adding to the stress, because if you're, let's say, a hospital worker going in, a nurse or a doctor, you don't know this disease that well and how it behaves and what it'll do to you, because it's so random, right? There were new things that we were trying to figure out at the time. And so imagine that stress. And so what I realized at that moment as I was joining Grainger was that we have a purpose to reduce that stress. We have a purpose to reduce that stress by providing them with the right products. So in this case, the right gloves, the right PPE equipment, right? To make sure that they can just focus on what they need to do is getting their job done, and they can go back to their families. And so as we think about this change, right, that we underwent, just went through within Grainger, I want you to keep this purpose in mind, right? Because everything anchors back to this purpose. So just a level setting a bit, the scope of this change and what we were working with at the time. When I joined, Johnny's first feedback to me was, you need to find the right talent. You need to make sure that we're thinking about aligning to the business. We need to rebuild our relationship with product management. There was a ton of friction that existed within Grainger. At the same time, how do we make sure that we're actually focused on the right things? And so one of the things that I did in the beginning was I worked with Thoughtworks. We sat down together. They presented their 5-pillar plan, and some of those pillars we leveraged, some of those pillars we put in the backlog. But nonetheless, what the result was building out, focused on domains, right? Our initial focus was organizing ourselves into domains where what you see in front of you were experienced teams and capabilities teams, where their purpose was try to, get their features completed in isolation, or at least independent of others, right? So try to focus on the capability and the products that they're building. And those products were powering these channels. Right? These channels, which we call our order origination channels, such as Grainger.com, KeepStock, which is an inventory management solution, or a set of products that feed into inventory management. But then also customer service, and if you walk into our brick and mortar stores, our Grainger branches. And in the bottom, what you see there in the middle is one of the things that the end of the first week, we actually blew up architecture. And we said, Johnny said, hey, Anaf, why don't you rebuild architecture? And so we rebuilt the architecture team. We focused on platform and engineering enablement and effectiveness. We started up a common engineering function called resiliency engineering and core engineering. And that was to just fulfill the promises that we typically make when we talk about, quote unquote, a transformation or a change that we're trying to drive. And at the bottom here, let's focus on the bottom. There we go. Size of this team, size of this org, 590 people plus or minus a few. And 76 delivery teams, and so the list goes on. But if you go on the right side, rebuilding architecture, upgrading or upskilling our talent, aligning our vendors to one mission, and that was a big deal because we had different types of vendors that existed. Some were strategic, some were non-strategic, but yet just basically staff aug. And then what wasn't really a primary focus at the time, but it came to be in that way, was how do we improve our experience of our developers and engagement of our engineers? And so if we're going to hire many people, then we want to retain those individuals. We don't want them to leave within a year, right? And so how do we do that? And so I'm going to break this down into three very, very basic, it's just a basic framework, right, with three pretty common parts that I think, Otto had presented not too long ago, just a few hours ago, but then you saw the same theme reoccur across different presentations in different ways, right, which is around people, process, and tech and tools. So I'm going to focus on people a little bit more than process, then a little bit more than tech, because tech is pretty common. But we'll talk about some of the more critical things there as well. So how do you build trust? How do you make sure that you're fulfilling on your commitments? And so as an engineer, going back to the challenge that Johnny had given me of building and recruiting teams, and part of that is to make sure that I can sit down and have a conversation with an engineer, all the way up to a product leader, and make sure that help them understand how they are a part of this solution and this destination that we're trying to get to, and how they are going to not only learn, but also thrive and also make a difference as they go through this journey. And so being able to take a step back and go back to your roots as an engineer and having that conversation at that senior or that junior engineer level all the way up is pretty critical. The other thing that I focused on with this team, with my team, is really building the right set of leaders and following through on those commitments. So whenever I have a conversation with my direct staff at the time that they were candidates, wouldn't it be great if you came into a company where you thought about all these things that you wanted to do, and which every company says that they're going to do, but then they don't get the support to do it. Either it's support financially, or it's leadership that says yes, but then they don't follow through. How about coming into a company where we're actually going to get stuff done? Right? That's a profound statement. That's a profound conversation to have for them to reflect on, and that resulted in building the right team. So the other things that we did when we think about the broader scope of Grainger at the engineering level was we launched dojos as part of our engineering effectiveness. So engineering effectiveness, and what Ryan Murray had shared was, here's a value stream. We want to compress the value stream, and we want to make sure that we're rooting out waste. And we did something similar, right? Well, we applied it in a way by leveraging dojos. So if you don't know what dojos are, they're an environment where you immerse teams to allow them to focus on their backlogs, but then at the same time, you augment those teams with some coaches. And those hands-on coaches are working with those teams to address the gaps that they have, right? It could be skill set gaps, it could be process gaps. And so we've launched around 100 dojos all through the last 3 years. Some of these dojos are very much considered what we call flash dojos, where it's like one small thing and it's a day or two, to having 6-week dojos or 3 sprint dojos where they focus on making sure that there's a broader process change or broader tooling change that needs to happen. So they go through that process with them over the next 6 weeks. And so varying flavors of dojos. We had this team also launch our first tech conference. So we brought in external speakers and internal speakers to talk about various topics. So these internal speakers, you think about our engineers talking about what they love to talk about is the work that they're doing, and so they have an opportunity to showcase that work. This is all independent of the 2-week sprint reviews or the demos that we typically would do with our stakeholders and our internal teams. This is here's a set of things that I've built over a period of time that I think you should use, or here's a different way of thinking that I think you should leverage. We also have Ignite Weeks, which are quarterly, so every quarter, 1 week, and gives the teams an option to spend time learning. It gives them an option to get not only, it's like self-learning, but then also instructor-led learning, or even we invite folks from the business to talk about the business. Because as engineers, sometimes we just don't get that visibility, and it gives them an opportunity to get that visibility to understand how we run the business and how that can then tie back to the work that they're doing. And then, one of the other things that we did was we moved away from here's a curriculum that every engineer is to take, and you go off and you take it, to just-in-time training, where if you're going to learn something, you want to then use it right away, versus just learning and then you lose the skill set over a period of time if you're not going to use it. So we rejiggered the way we thought about training, and we made it just in time. And then finally, communities of practice. We all talked about communities of practice. Ryan just brought up communities of practice as well. The main thing there is, how do you sustain communities of practice? Right? How do you make sure that the topics and the audience, right, they're engaged? And so what we did here was we set expectations with our engineering leaders that you will drive these topics, and you will participate and engage, and you'll bring other people along. And if you don't, that's essentially part of your expectation and role and responsibility. So we're driving that within the community to be able to build that community. And so as we think about people, right, hiring the right people who make a difference, now this goes back to the mindset, the skill set, and how that equation comes together. So that's pretty critical. Making sure that, the commitments that I as a leader make, I actually fulfill and follow through, right? That's how you build trust at the end of the day. And then the journey, right? You gotta be able to demonstrate what that journey looks like, take them on that path. And I always use the analogy of crossing the bridge, right? So if you wanna get to the other side of the bridge, you gotta either show them the path and allow them to either run across the bridge, walk across the bridge, crawl across the bridge, or grab their ears and pull them across the bridge. In some cases, what ends up happening is that they decide not to cross the bridge, or they may jump off the bridge, right? And I say this in this manner because you have to help them understand what that journey is and get them to that point of making a decision. Because either they're part of this change or not. And I would rather have them understand if they're a part of that change on their own. Sometimes I have to nudge, but I would rather have them get to that point themselves. And then finally, going back to our inspiration, going back to our purpose, right, is continuously, you got to keep it in your back pocket, and you got to deliver it continuously, right? So continuous inspiration is a thing, right? We have to make sure that every town hall that you have, or every opportunity that you have in front of a larger audience, right, that you give that audience the opportunity to understand the message that, boy, the work that you're doing, how that ties back to this broader mission that we have, right? And every time I go on a customer visit or a branch visit or a distribution center visit, it gives me an opportunity to understand what makes us, what makes our business run and how that can tie back to the work that we do. All right, so how do you drive consistent ways of working? This term, ways of working, has been, over the last day and a half, I think we've used this term more than a few times. This is the beauty of working with Thoughtworks. They use the same terms and they use the same definitions. It's like ice cream, right? It's ice cream. You're eating ice cream, but it's different flavors, right? So every company has a different flavor, right? So for us, it's all about making sure that we're thinking about, at the product level, thinking about a vision with the business. And the vision with the business needs to be fully aligned and clear. We recently were undergoing we're building out another vision document, and this 27-page vision document was in partnership with the business, with our architecture team, and our product management team. And at the end of that, we had clear alignment on what we needed to do, or what the focus was, and now we are transitioning into design groups where we're sitting down and talking about what are those true problems that we need to solve, and then how do we measure them, and then that manifests itself in the roadmap eventually, right? And so that's the next step there, and that's what we've been doing across different teams, right? We started with one team, and we've expanded that process out to other areas. On the engineering side, we're focused on sensible defaults, another term you probably heard over the last day and a half. Our sensible defaults, I'll give you one example. When we ask our teams to do TDD, test-driven development, right? it's not a binary action, right, where you just do test-driven development and you write your test as you're writing your code. It's all about how do you build software that's testable, right? How do you build software that's maintainable? How do you build software that can be continuous delivery? As I separated that out from sensible defaults because it is part of the sensible defaults, but yet it's a bigger thing. And so continuous delivery, we've been talking about it for, what, a decade? And before that, people have been practicing even continuous delivery before it was even called continuous delivery. But that's something that we're also working on. We're working through it. A lot of our teams are getting to this point or have gotten to this point, and we want to continue to reinforce that message. And then ultimately, all of this comes back with stakeholder management, right, where you need to make sure that all, the things that you're working on at the vision level, how that translates into a design group and then to a roadmap, and what the things that you're working on within engineering and building up engineering, all of that needs to come back and be demonstrated to our stakeholders. Because in the past, it was only about the features that we deliver, but today, it's also about the improvements that we're making in our ways of working, which brings me to the next point, which is driving alignment with our stakeholders, making sure that we're setting expectations. Did I go back? Okay, no, I didn't. Consistency enables flexibility, and then continuous improvement helps us focus. This is all about our operational reviews that we're starting to work on, and it's a new thing for us. We're doing this on a monthly basis, and eventually we're going to be bringing it back up to our CTO Johnny as well as our Chief Product Officer to help them understand the improvements that our teams are making. This is a next step in the journey in our maturity, and so we've earned the right to get to this point, and eventually from there we're going to then move into more of what Ryan's talking about in terms of setting and driving expectations so that we can actually deliver on engineering effectiveness, right? The true spirit of it. And then finally, tools and technology. Not going to spend too much time on this, but one thing I'll just highlight a couple of examples. We made a decision to buy a tool. Before it was made based on, this is the tool that we like. Some people have, we use the analogy of having tattoos, tool tattoos, right? Or being, just embedded or, just very close and with certain platforms, right? And so what we've done is we've changed the topic around what is the business problem that we're actually trying to solve, and how do we drive a better customer, or in this case, a developer experience. And so a lot of the platforms that we're using are driving towards those two factors, that business problem and developer experience. And then architecture is, one thing that I worked with Thoughtworks on in the past was building out a tech strategy. We included not only a tech architecture, but then also a tech strategy, but then also self-service and an operating model. Eventually, it boiled down to, or it distilled down to engineering effectiveness. And so we're on a mature journey there, and now we're transitioning that into a broader strategy and seeing what else do we need to evolve to start thinking about the next set of things that we should be focused on. And then ultimately, everything is developer productivity, as I've talked about before. There's a lot there. You can really double-click into this and go into a lot of details. Ryan Murray did a great talk, or just delivered a great talk on developer productivity. I can't say it. But if more information from Ryan, but you can also talk to me about it, and we need to mind meld anyway. So here's some takeaways, right? Selecting tech can be easy, but lead with the problem that we're trying to solve. Help engineers focus on what matters. And then finally, remember, tools and tech evolve. You got to get to a continuous architecture as part of this, right? Because your underlying platforms are going to continue to evolve, and so you got to make sure that you have the right foundation in place to derive that agility. But one of the other things that we're focused on is also making sure that we understand our purpose by experiencing it. And what I mean by that is, whether it's going to a military base and where we have our Grainger branch, and we allow our military personnel to get what they need when they need it, to going overseas and working with our resellers to sell products and materials to, let's say, the oil and gas industry, or is going into a cave in Kansas City and going through the distribution center where you see a plethora of cones, like an endless supply of cones. But nonetheless, it's different experiences, whether it's internal or external, that gives us the opportunity to understand the business. What you see here is the Kansas City distribution center. And this is a distribution center where it takes in all the supply and material from the West Coast and then fans it out into the East Coast. And so there's every area has a different experience. Every team member has a different experience. So being able to tie all that back together is pretty critical for us. And so we have to learn about the customers, and learning about the customers gives us an understanding of what we need to do to build the right products for them to solve their problems. And all of this continues to evolve. Our business continues to evolve, so our technology is going to continuously evolve, and we got to just make sure that there's a good, strong feedback loop. And then finally, I know I'm a little bit over, I'll make it quick here. I talked about engagement scores, and the one thing I would highlight is that, and this wasn't on purpose, we weren't intending to do this, but it ended up being in this way where we went from 79 and 80% all the way up through to 93% of our engineers' engagement with us. And so there's a good amount of improvement that we've made along the way. I think we're doing something right. We need to sustain that, or at least find out what the right level should be as we think about the next set of things that we need to focus on. Thank you very much. Have a good day.